Just to add a bit of colour to that, I assume that you're referring to the Anthony King report when they talk about King. The Anthony King report, and you can dig this out if you like, said that in terms of BBC coverage of the 4 UK nations, that a large proportion of the coverage is vague, confusing or inaccurate. If they do specify countries of application, they tend to do it only once. The UK, Britain and England are often used interchangeably. We, us and they are often used when talking about England. Attempts to compare and contrast policies between the nations are rare. Coverage of politics across the 4 nations is often seen through Westminster eyes. There are 6 other points, bullet points, which I won't bore you with. It becomes tedious after a while. This report, by the way, was published in June 2008. So none of the issues we're talking about tonight are unknown. And I don't want to talk too much about the BBC, but I would just ask...
you see it all the time, and you've got the coverage of the GCSE issue since last summer, and the problems they were having there. That got massive coverage in all the bulletins. Compare that with the coverage in the network media about the Scottish new curriculum for excellence, which never featured at all. That's the kind of problem you get. You get this kind of overload. It's very strange when you're working in the media in Scotland, because you have this kind of huge overload of London-based material, which is very difficult to translate into Scottish terms. And quite often, people just capitulate it, and they start saying, well, it's us, and they ignore the Scottish dimension altogether.
By the way, the King report also said that reports from elsewhere in the UK that get national coverage are usually about crime, sport, or human interest, or merely quirky. I think we can all recognise that. Could I just ask very quickly, if I may indulge, how the panellists feel about addressing Tom's point about if broadcasting were devolved, would terribly much change? And maybe one way to effect such a change would be how the broadcasting regulator is organised. I mean, for example...
The variable of change to a devolved system would have to go along with other variables. And the chances of those other influences being brought to bear, I think, would be much significantly greater if there had, first of all, been the devolved process. But the devolved process is by no means a panacea and contains its own dangers if implemented alone.
One way to effect a huge change would be to say, let any Scottish Broadcasting Corporation, whatever terminology is appropriate, let it be elected.
You mean the Regulatory Commission?
No, what I'm saying is that the body in charge of broadcasting,
I mean, anything would be better than the patronage system that exists at the moment, which is 18th century in its vibrancy. So, I mean, anything like that, I think, opening the thing up, getting people's views. But I go back to the point I made earlier. How does the Parliament here, even in the current situation, bring influence to bear to try and change things? They probably will not be able to affect very quickly the resource situation. But I'm thinking of how the skill in the BBC is allowed to flourish here in order, by dint of changes in managerial attitude. There seems to be a combination of deafness and blindness. I don't know of anybody, in particular the chattering classes, recognising that there are pockets of excellence, as we've all said tonight, would root and branch defend the existing system. It is a suitable case for treatment. But how do you do that when people are not even willing to appear before the committees of this House?
2007, I was kind of peripherally involved in setting up the Scottish Broadcasting Commission, and that had a direct impact. First of all, it had the King report. The King report was largely a response to the Scottish Broadcasting Commission's report, and that was very critical of the present arrangements, and its recommendations were not implemented, but you have to keep the pressure up. The second thing was that the BBC did restructure its affairs, and it pumped a lot more money north of the border. Now, a lot of it went into areas like, Waterloo Road and Question Time, which weren't directly addressing the problem of, if you like, the broadcasting deficit in Scotland, which is the fact that there isn't a national broadcaster to reflect a national political culture here. But these were important steps. And the point is the Parliament must realise that it does have power, it does have influence, and if it keeps at it, there will be changes.
And it should also, the Parliament should get madder about it.
Get madder, absolutely.
It should be much more aware.
And Joan's been very good at getting mad about it, I can tell you.
Should be brazenly engaged with this and get really mad about it, because it is a vital part of our national life.
There's some pointers there. Yes.
I'm just a wee bit annoyed that the people's voice has not been heard too much. Never mind. That's by the way. The point I want to make is that cultural cringe is part of our whole cultural heritage. It's endemic in this society. When I was in primary school, I had a Gaelic-speaking headmaster who beat every child who spoke Gaelic. I come from that background. Now I can't listen to Radio Scotland. It makes me cringe. I'm belting myself. And what I'm saying is psychologically Scotland's like that. Our democratically elected First Minister can be called wee egg in Parliament, and we all think it's a laugh. We are all belting ourselves. Tom knows that in order to stop a people being vital, you stop their voice, and we beat ourselves with our own cultural cringe. Now, how do you change the psychology? Because I don't think we will get a devolved a media service at all in Scotland if they do sort of...
Obviously what you're saying is historically accurate.
Absolutely.
But I think there is a sea change, and I think there's some evidence of that, especially among the next generation. Patrick and I had the privilege of listening to some of that next generation on a programme on BBC television, of which we were panel members. And obviously there had been a lot of training being put into the 1,000 youngsters who came from all over Scotland to speak. But by God, they were articulate. And they were much more articulate than my generation could ever be. And I teach, especially in the University of Edinburgh, because of its high proportion of students from certain social backgrounds south of the border. And I'm not talking about housing schemes in Newcastle either. And I've seen, after having a lifetime experience of Strathclyde, Aberdeen University and now Edinburgh, I have seen, certainly among that age group compared to mine, the cringe is, if not melting away, it's a generation which has got a greater sense of itself. And there's a whole variety of indicators that under the surface, I'm talking now as a historian, beneath the surface, there are changes going on, not least in culture, in history writing, in the cultural dynamic of everything from art to music, to pop music, to the kind of thing we were talking about yesterday on Start the Week. And so I would agree with you, but I think the situation is now becoming unrelentingly more complex in this small country than it was, say, 30 to 40 years ago. I mean, it always interests me that the great popular author of that period in terms of my subject area was John Preble in the 1960s, late 50s, 60s and early 70s, whose story of Scotia was tragedy. The Highland clearances, Culloden, the Darien disaster and all that. And he was able to write very well. So he certainly sold a lot more than academics. But now, the new flavour of the month is the Scottish Enlightenment, subtitled How Western Europe's Poorest People Invented Our World and Everything in It. This is the citation index for the government, the governing party of which you are a part. I mean, I've heard every single cabinet secretary quote from that vacuous text, and very rarely from the texts of indigenous Scottish historians, because that text is written by an American whom we like to stroke us. Okay? But so I think there's a sense in our reading matter, we're beginning to move from the cringe area to a level of, benign braggadocio. Benign braggadocio. But I think I agree with you that probably the core of the nation is still where it was. The changes, however, I hope at least, are underway. And this building is a manifestation of that.
That's a positive message. I think we have some questions here and there.
Hi, I'm John Thompson. I was actually the member of the public who managed to get on Newswatch to do with the comment facility being removed from the general public. And what I discovered was that usually when the production team don't put someone up, it's usually because they've got an unanswerable case. And on my particular slot, BBC Scotland sent in a statement instead of putting somebody up. And the statement was actually, the production team actually asked me, what does that statement mean? You know, so the BBC couldn't understand what their own BBC Scotland statement meant. And it was absolute gobbledygook. The thing which so it was really to touch on the comments thing, how that public deficit is going to be addressed. And one final question in the style of question time is the stupid question at the end. How terminally ill now is BBC Scotland when people are starting to believe the stories that are appearing on a spoof site called BBC Scotlandshire more than BBC Scotland?
There's no answer to that. Yes, ma'am.
We've concentrated quite rightly on Scotland's national broadcasting vis-à-vis the BBC, but I don't think we should forget about the regional aspects of Scotland as well. You know, I come from the northeast. We've lost Grampian TV. We used to make really good programmes, and we haven't addressed tonight at all the regionalisation, the regions of Scotland, and we shouldn't look at it as one homogenous Glasgow-centric BBC Scotland that gives you your sport and your weather. You know, we've got to think about the regions of Scotland as well. And, you know, to address Ian's point about the media, the print press, you know, maybe it's because of the Glasgow-centric radio and TV broadcasting that the P&J, with its many editions, is bucking the trend of other Scottish national newspapers. So I don't think we should forget about that.
The success of the P&J is a metaphor for the kind of thing you're talking about. And the recognition that, although we're a very small country, and I think, thinking of some of the comments of my American graduate students, it's a mosaic of a country. It's a veritable wee mosaic of accents, cultures, activities and concerns. And certainly the media, if it's at all possible, should reflect that in a way that the P&J, for some parts of Scotland, does so magnificently.
Ian Grant, obviously the cringe issue is getting better. Yes, it's getting better despite the efforts of the BBC. I mean, if you look around Scotland from Ullapool to Salmorostig to all around the country, there's wonderful cultural things going on. There's good music, there's good drama, there's good discussion, political fora and so on. None of that, absolutely zero, is reflected in the output of BBC Scotland. There's no regional stuff within Scotland. There's absolutely no decent output. And we're not talking about politics. I mean, politics is important, but the cultural side is awful. And of course, because there's now virtually nothing. We used to criticise the White Heather Club and so on, but there's just zero now. And so that anything that ever creeps through is inevitably poor, and it's really cringeworthy, a lot of it. And I just don't know what you do about it. I just think it's so bad. Everybody in this room has been sort of saying, well, the BBC's it's glass half full and so on. It's not, it's awful. And it's completely and utterly devaluing this country. I mean, this country that has done so much in all fields, and yet we have to put up with just an abomination of a broadcasting
Well
service.
said, sir. But I hate to be immodest about this, but that's more or less the line I've been taking, less eloquently than yourself, all night. Get angry people about it. It's a disgrace, and as I said during that debate, because I was the anonymous contributor when Ian was the chair, it is a national humiliation. Get angry about it. We must get something done about it. ASCP.
Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Rob Connell. I was interested to hear someone say that the BBC does regard one of its key roles as being someone who holds the United Kingdom together. And I think that's been reflected in much of its coverage of the independence debate, and indeed in much of the rest of the media as well. I'd just like to ask the panel if they believe, well, how damaging do you think that is to the quality of the independence debate, and indeed how damaging it might be to the reputation of the BBC, and what can be done about it?
Sorry, who would like to respond first? Yes, sir, at the back. Yeah, and then.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question. It's really to do with what Tom Devine's saying. I can continually hear people saying, how are we going to do something about it? I can get angry, like lots of people I know get angry about it, but we seem to be unable to deal with it. John and I sat in front of the BBC Trust being told that by definition they were independent, and the guy who said this was a political advisor, and he said it without any hint of irony in a straight face, because the Queen appointed the bloke. I mean, you know, it's so bad. As the gentleman said earlier, BBC Scotlandshire is more credible. But what can we do about it when the BBC Trust produces a report proud of its output, despite the fact it's referring to criticism, inept though the Audience Council is, and puts up as its headline success Mrs. Brown, for Christ's sake. You know, it's an Irish programme, but they're proud of that being fantastically successful. They don't seem to have any sense of shame, and no one seems capable of being able to get at them. So
that is so brilliant. Thank you for that. The buck stops with this House here. This is the only forum that can do something about it. It might not be able to do very much about it at the moment, but it's the only source of pressure coming from the national voice of the nation. And I don't think they're doing enough, frankly.
We don't have too much more time. Yes, sir.
Personally, I feel it's the job of the state broadcaster not merely to inform, but to nurture debate and discussion amongst the general population. I'm very fortunate that I was one of the generation that grew up with the internet, and I've been online since about 1988 and part of the blogger network. It's not a recent phenomenon. I find it deeply, deeply offensive that the population of Scotland is not allowed to comment on political articles online on BBC Scotland, where other parts of the UK can comment on their own stories. And there was recently almost an accident whereby we were allowed to comment on the Barusa letter and the Scotsman article. And there wasn't a lot of hasty, nasty comment. It was a very cultured, political, sensible debate with some very worthwhile discussion. And why is the BBC Scotland so afraid of the population having their say at a public level?
Okay. You must bear in mind we may be thrown out at any minute, but I'd rather have your questions than... Yes, madam.
Can I just say that there's another way in which to try and influence the BBC? I stopped paying my licence fee and stopped watching it, and if everybody in Scotland was to do that and they were to lose 325 million, that might have some impact as well.
I'm not altogether sure there's a connection between those two connections. Yes.
I actually want it's too late now really to explore the whole question of the opt-out on the BBC, because two things are really problematic. One, I've been involved and know many people who've been trying to put forward very, very good programme ideas to BBC Scotland, many of which have not been taken up because there's simply not either the money to do it or certainly the airtime to actually even run it. And there's nowhere else really to go with a lot of that stuff. And recently, the film that was handed to BBC Scotland on a plate, You've Been Trumped, was rejected by BBC Scotland. Now, as it happens, that was probably quite a good idea because they got an enthusiastic response in London and it was seen by 3 million people or whatever, whereas it had gone out in a Scottish opt-out, you know, we'd have just seen it. But it seems to me you cannot have a national, we just need to accept, you cannot have a proper national broadcaster who's having to opt out of basically a much larger country's, the UK's, national broadcaster. It just didn't work.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's the point that's been made time and time again.
I'm not quite sure why we're having this meeting, because, I mean, you know...
Well, well, I can offer a whole bunch of reasons, but...
Good.
Yeah. So, yes, Ewan, I think this probably needs to be the very last question.
Perhaps a solution, if I might. Gathering all the range of comments, criticisms and other views around broadcast media, regulatory issue, local press being allowed to be bought up by large international businesses, and the diminution of quality that we've seen as a result of things like that. But in summary, a solution to all of this problem probably lies in 2014 and voting yes, because at that point this Parliament will have the proper control over the outcomes that we want.
Thank you for that. We need to bring proceedings to a close. As I said, we're probably way beyond our allotted time here, and I don't want to sort of presume too much on the services here. Can I please ask you all to join me in thanking the panel, who I think have been fantastic tonight. And if we get an opportunity next year, perhaps we can continue this debate in a more extended form. I'd also like you, please, to thank the people from the Constitutional Commission. I want to give them a name check, because none of this can happen without a lot of hard work from a lot of dedicated people. And in particular, I'd like to thank Alex Grant. I'd like to thank Hisashi, who've done a fantastic amount of work here. Together with John and all the others. None of this, again, at the risk of repeating myself, would be possible without them. And I'd like you, on behalf of me, to thank them. And last but by no means least, I think you ought to applaud yourselves, because I think you've made a major contribution to the success of this evening. As I said earlier, there is a box outside for donations, and there's also a box for suggestions, because we intend to continue this series of lectures next year, and we very much appreciate your views on the topics and themes and subjects that we ought to be addressing during the course of next year. So your suggestions are very much appreciated. If you feel that you don't want to make a suggestion right now, by all means go to our Facebook page. And one last plug, and that is that a member of the Constitutional Commission, in fact, is organising a conference on a Scottish Constitution at the Sorbonne in March next year. And I think there are maybe one or two places open there for observers. The speakers will consist of some of the most illustrious constitutional experts from across the world. So it serves to underscore the fact that though the coverage here may be somewhat patchy, the interest elsewhere never ceases to diminish. In fact, it tends to enhance. So there's lots of things happening out there. There's lots of things for the media in various forums to report. And I think that is likely to continue and grow. I thank you again, all of you, for your attention tonight. And please look forward to the next series of meetings next year. Thank you again.